Hey there again, friends and viewers. In case you forgot, my name is Hengest. I'm one of the new directors here at TGN. And being a new director, I wanted to make sure that the stuff I'm putting up is new. It's fresh, so to speak. I want to make sure that it's not a repeat, and it's what you guys really want to see. So I had a little chit chat with my boy Big C and asked him, hey Curtis, what is it that TGN World of Warcraft really needs? What is it that you guys don't have? What are they asking for? And what's going to be a hit? And he said without much hesitation that mage videos, mage reviews, mage guides, you guys just want a mage director. And my main is a druid, but I know the mage very well. So I said, well, Curtis, I've already made mage guides in the past. I'm going to go ahead and update all my mage guides to patch 4.06 and beyond for TGN World of Warcraft, and they're going to love it. So today, I'm going to start off with the first one of those guides, being the Arcane Mage, and let's get right into the video. See you there. Hello friends and viewers, and welcome to my Arcane Mage guide for patch 4.06. Today, I'll be reviewing a fairly universal DPS spec that can be used interchangeably both in heroic dungeons and raid encounters. Unfortunately, the Arcane spec carries with it the negative connotation that DPSing through the specialization as a whole is merely a two-button process that can be accomplished simply by rolling one's face upon his or her keyboard. Well, I'm happy to inform you that that is not the case, and although the Arcane Mage may have been extremely basic in patch 3.3, with the addition of masteries in patch 4.0, the spec has become perhaps the most mathematical in the game. If you're a person that takes organization very seriously or writes your life down on a planner, the Arcane spec will most likely suit you. If you're more spontaneous and impatient, then you're probably going to be more drawn towards fire, but we'll get to that in a later video. To begin, let's take a look at the base abilities we have at our disposal simply by choosing the Arcane talent tree. Firstly, we take a look at Arcane Barrage. This is an extremely mana-efficient spell that can be used in emergency situations for PvE combat. It's an instant cast that does a strong amount of damage. Secondly, we have the Arcane Specialization. This merely increases all the damage you deal with arcane spells by 25%. This mechanic was implemented in patch 4.0 to discourage mages from using spells outside of their primary school of magic, both to simplify the complexity for newer players and to give them more of a theme that corresponds to their strengths. Lastly, we examine the mastery. Most masteries are standard multiplicative or percentage-based values that are increased in a linear fashion depending on the values of your gear. The Mana Adept Mastery is quite possibly the most unique in the game, given that the numerical values are somewhat hidden, and they vary so very much depending on your playstyle. Essentially, if you're at 100% full mana, your damage output will be increased by a standard percentage-based number, which can be modified depending on your level of mastery. However, as you begin to spend your mana, that damage bonus is decreased depending on the amount of mana you are withholding at any given time. Translation is, the more mana you have, the more damage you deal. So before we go too in depth on how that affects your DPS rotation, let's first examine my talent build and go over why I've chosen to spec this particular way. I'm going to be very thorough with this explanation, seeing as how this is the first guide I'll be uploading to TGN, and the viewers have no basis for my previous guides. So here's my talent build. I've chosen to place 33 points in Arcane, 5 in Fire, and 3 in Frost. Let's start with Arcane Concentration. This ability gives you a 10% chance to proc a clear cast, which means the following spell you cast that deals damage will cost you no mana. Because the conservation of mana plays an integral role in dealing damage as an Arcane Mage, this is one of the best talents you can take. Improved Counterspell. Although this may aid you in crowd controlling scenarios, the potential benefits of a silence in a PvE scenario are easily outweighed by the alternatives. This is, for the most part, exclusively a PvP talent. Netherwind Presence. This talent increases your haste rating by a solid 3%, which means it thereby increases any and all haste you acquire on gear, ultimately making this a very powerful choice. Not only that, but it's required to unlock the next tier of talents. Put all 3 points in the previous 2. Next we have Torment the Weak. This talent has been reworked tremendously for Cataclysm, and now increases all damage that you deal on targets that have been slowed. Against a single target, this means you'll be benefiting from this about 99% of the time, making Torment the Weak a must-have. It's a standard 6% damage bonus. Invocation. This grants you 10% bonus damage for 8 seconds after you successfully interrupt an enemy's spell. This is Blizzard's way of encouraging mages to use counterspells against enemy NPCs, which more than justifies taking this talent. 10% bonus damage is extremely powerful, so you will be highly incentivized to stop your current spell cast to interrupt an enemy, just to receive that damage bonus. The following macro will aid you greatly in getting off those counterspells as quickly as humanly possible. Improved Arcane Missiles. No need to explain this talent, just put 2 points in here. Improved Blink. Now this may seem like a PvP talent, and it is, but if you consider just how valuable a 70% movement speed increase is, even if it's just for 3 seconds in some of the movement intensive fights we're encountering in Cataclysm, a logical player will take this talent any day of the week. It is very helpful when maneuvering and dodging incoming AoE damage. Arcane Flows. This is one of your most essential talents, for without it, the entire basis for burst damage as an Arcane Mage would crumble. You need to have the cooldown reduction on your evocation and arcane power spells. There simply isn't anything more to say about it. Presence of Mind. This is a prerequisite to Arcane Flows, so that alone justifies taking it, but it will also help you to expedite the recycling of a damage rotation. This we'll get to shortly. Missile Barrage. Like its lower tier counterpart, it is absolutely essential to fill this out. Prismatic Cloak. This can be helpful to your healers, which is always something to consider, but we'll see how this can actually be detrimental to your damage capabilities further down the road. Improved Polymorph can help you with crowd control, but it certainly isn't necessary. It's more of a PvP exclusive talent, so let's skip it for now. Arcane Tactics. This talent passively increases the amount of damage you and all your party members deal by approximately 3%, by exactly 3%, which is fantastic. However, both Beast Mastery Hunters and Retribution Paladins can bring this buff to a group as well, and they don't stack, so if you're coordinating with your raid group, you may not need to take this. It'd be a real bummer to queue into a dungeon group without it though, so I'd recommend you just take it for insurance. Incanter's Absorption. This talent has been historically the most misunderstood in the arcane tree. It states that any amount of damage your Mana Shield or Mage Ward abilities absorb will be effectively converted into bonus damage for 10 seconds. The amount of damage increase you acquire is 20% of the damage you receive, and can be refreshed before the duration of the buff expires should you be hit again. It's tough to calculate just how reliable this damage boost can be, but in heroic dungeons I've noticed bonuses as high as nearly 1500 spell power for a solid 10 seconds just from taking AoE damage during a boss fight. That, my friends, is more valuable than a trinket proc because it has no internal cooldown. And this is the reason I mentioned that Prismatic Cloak may harm your damage, because the less damage you absorb through those two abilities, the less spell power you will subsequently gain from this ability. All you have to do is find the optimal time to reapply your Mana Shield and or Mage Ward. This is my favorite arcane talent, and it is greatly underappreciated among players. Next is Improved Arcane Explosion. This talent will reduce the global cooldown of Arcane Blast significantly, and also deal decrease the threat generated so much you can literally spam this ability instead of using Blizzard or Flame Strike to deal top-notch damage. Don't forget that it deals extra damage because of the arcane specialization. It's not as mana efficient, but it can deal absurd amounts of damage and be done while moving, which is the key point. Arcane potency. Anytime you gain a clear cast, which is a 10% probability, or use your presence of mind, which is a 1.5 minute cooldown, your next 2 attacks will have a 15% increased critical strike chance. This is extremely valuable and mandatory. Next, we take a look at slow. This is your way of guaranteeing that your targets are taking full damage from Torment the Weak. Although every tank class has a slowing debuff that should be up on their primary target at all times, rendering this ability useless, it has been built into the infrastructure of the class. You may never need to use it, but it almost always can be considered as insurance should things go awry. Nether Vortex simply grants your Arcane Blast spell, which is your primary ability, a chance to apply slow, which ultimately renders the actual spell itself useless, but you can still cast slow on a target before you begin to cast to give your tank a moment to gain aggro, etc. You need only put 1 point in Nether Vortex because you should be using Arcane Blast so often that the debuff should never fall off of your target, meaning Torment the Weak should be active, like I said, 99% of the time. Focus Magic is a buff that is applied individually to a target of your choice. It increases their crit chance by 3%, and anytime they crit, you gain 3% bonus critical strike rating. This directly benefits your damage, so use it on the target that has the highest probability to crit with spells. Improved Mana Gem. This is a very awesome ability that grants you spell power equal to 2% of your maximum mana for 10 seconds. Essentially, this can be viewed as an on-use trinket, apart from the fact that using mana gems solely for their mana regenerative qualities is essential to strong DPS as an Arcane Mage by itself. This is one of your most powerful talents. Lastly, we take a look at Arcane Power. By the time you get here, it's a cooldown that will be 1.5 minutes. This ability will increase your damage, but if you use it improperly, it will actually hurt your damage. So just because it's on a short cooldown does not mean you should use it every time it's ready. It increases the damage you deal by 20%, but the spells cost an extra 10% mana to use. If you remember the mastery, you deal more damage if you have more mana, so by decreasing your mana pool too drastically, you can actually be doing more harm than good. Use this ability when you are above approximately 70% mana, or if you're casting in an ultra conservative manner. Otherwise, you will upset the reliability of your mana pool, and you won't get the results you're after. Okay, so that's all the arcane talents I've taken in this build. Let's move on to the other 2 trees. In Fire, I've taken the Master of Elements talent. Anytime you crit, you regain 30% of the mana cost of the ability you used. As an Arcane Mage, that directly translates into actual damage. I've also taken Burning Soul, because although conserving your mana as an Arcane Mage is important, you also need to be able to spend it quickly at times, and you cannot afford to be hindered by incoming AoE splash damage. Fill this talent out to guarantee some reliable numbers. And lastly, we venture into the Frost tree, where I've conveniently taken Piercing Ice, which simply increases my standard critical strike chance by 3%, which is very complementary with Master of Elements. The glyphs for Arcane Mage should be very self-explanatory. Firstly, you need to take the glyph of Arcane Blast. It flat out increases the damage that your ability deals by 3%, and after that comes the glyph of Mage Armor. You should always have Mage Armor active when playing as an Arcane Mage, and taking this glyph increases the mana that it restores by 20%. Next, you need to take the glyph of Arcane Missiles, which increases the critical strike chance of the ability by 5%. You may consider the glyph of Arcane Barrage in the coming future, but as of right now this is the best choice. The only other glyph you can take that will affect your damage output is the glyph of Mirror Image, which essentially boosts the damage that they deal by 25% due to the Arcane Specialization ability. The other glyphs I've taken here, although they won't add to your damage, they'll greatly add to your utility and survivability in any given encounter. Okay, so now that we have our talent build and glyphs in order, we can start doing some damage, right? Perhaps. But if you really want to understand the numerical values, you need to first become sure that you have an understanding of the stat prioritizations. I'm going to make this very simple because I don't want to bombard you with too many things to think about too quickly. So for the sake of this guide being friendly with beginners, allow me to just give you a basic hierarchy of stats. Most theory crafters would tell you that intellect is the be-all end-all stat for all arcane mages, and that simply isn't true. No amount of spell power or endurance will count for anything if you simply cannot hit your target. Now you can experiment with different hit values, given the amount of it is necessary to hit the cap against a raid boss these days is absolutely tremendous, but I will tell you from experience that if you're trying to learn how to do a DPS rotation well, you need to be able to hit your target very consistently. If you can't, you'll become confused by your rotation and become frustrated as well. I would strongly recommend you acquire enough hit rating to acquire a 0% chance on a heroic dungeon boss, mischance I meant, so that practicing for higher tier content is made easier. Once you've accomplished this, you may start to accumulate as much intellect as possible. It's easy to factor in values of critical strike and haste, but the reality is intellect grants you spell power, critical strike chance, and most importantly mana, which for an arcane mage is the most valuable stat, given that it is the only number affected by the mastery. If there were one class that is most dependent upon any single stat in World of Warcraft, it is the arcane mage's dependency on intellect. So where do you go from there? That really depends on your playstyle. If you like to see big numbers and take your time with your rotation, then go with more crit. If you like burst damage and fast-paced casting, go with more haste. The mastery rating is much more complementary with haste, but the haste yields for much greater damage output on short duration fights. The reality is, the next most valuable stat depends on the situation. Personally, I would recommend you just find a balance and not try to reforge any gear towards any particular one, because where you may compromise haste, you'll lose out in your ability to burst. And by collecting too much haste, you lose your endurance and longevity in long duration boss fights. That's a great way to transition into the rotation for the spec. DPSing as an arcane mage is structured around two different playstyles. To do the maximum amount of damage, you must learn to become efficient at both. In a standard encounter, you want to deal as much damage as you can and as quickly as you can. Why? Because of evocation. The ability is on a 2-minute cooldown and will restore 60% of your overall mana over the course of 6 seconds, depending on your haste values. This has been effectively named the burn phase. It consists of you casting your Arcane Blast spell until your mana pool reaches around 85%, which will happen quickly given the nature of the attack. The use of Arcane Blast applies a buff or a debuff depending on the phase, which increases the damage that the attack deals by 13%, but increases the mana cost of the ability by 150%. In addition, the cast time is also reduced by 1/10 of a second. This means you deal a lot more damage, but as your mana pool wanes, that damage increase becomes less and less valuable. The Arcane Blast buff/debuff will stack 4 times. Each stack will take you further down this path, until the 4th, in which you are causing 52% additional damage with the ability and are able to cast it significantly faster, but it costs 6 times the mana. When you reach approximately 85% of your mana pool, you'll find it the best time to use a mana gem. This should take you very well near 100% mana, as well as giving you a very substantial spell power boost, furthering the amount of damage you do at this increased level of consumption. Now when it comes time to make a judgment call, you can choose to blow your cooldowns and continue casting Arcane Blast at this level, dealing an insane amount of damage, or you can try to predict where your mana pool will be in the near future, and how long you need to last before the fight is over. Once you factor that in, you can decide how quickly you want to bring your mana pool down to 35%. To reset the Arcane Blast buff, you need only to cast your Arcane Missiles proc, in which case you can reset your mana consumption to continue at a normal rate. If you need to reset the debuff immediately and do not have Arcane Missiles at your disposal, you can shoot an Arcane Barrage. Do the amount of damage you desire, but factor in how much longer you have. That is the key. Also, don't take too long, because every second you spend with Evocation off cooldown is damage that could be dealt in the future. Once you reach approximately 35% mana, quickly use your Evocation ability and be sure it doesn't get interrupted. If it does, your entire rotation has been obliterated. Once you are once again at full mana, it's time to transition into a much more conservative style of play. You can use abilities like Presence of Mind and Mirror Images to equalize the damage curve during this time. You must now deal as much damage as you can, with the objective of getting your mana pool back at 35% by the time your Evocation is off cooldown again. That's a 2-minute. Factoring in the use of another mana gem and a mana potion for max damage is also a part of this rotation. As an alchemist, the Vibrant Alchemist Stone is the best trinket I could think to use, because it increases the mana gain from potions by 40%. For most fights, the boss should be dead somewhere between the end of your conservative mana phase to the rise of your new burn phase, typically ending with a very high damage output. As you can see, doing damage as an Arcane Mage is based on planning, foresight, and making judgment calls, not on only pressing 2 buttons. You have to rely on your instincts when to use your damage cooldown abilities such as Arcane Power, when you're running out of mana or lingering at 10%. Those two things are the worst thing that could happen to your damage output. So, to review, the Arcane Mage is a very chill class with a very reliable DPS curve based on planning. It's also based on organization and foresight. Finding the right time to use your cooldowns in a particular scenario such as Evocation, or balancing the Arcane Blast debuff to keep your mana pool where it needs to be, and adapting to the types of encounters of a different boss are what will set you apart from other mages out there. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this guide by your buddy Hengest, and stay tuned for more to come. I'll see you guys next time.